Okay. So we're so thrilled that you've joined us virtually this afternoon, this evening. For those of you that I don't know, I'm Rabbi Zachary Goodman, and just on behalf of Holy Blossom and our co-sponsor Arts of Canada, I want to thank you for being here today. We're going to begin momentarily, but before we do, just a couple of housekeeping items. I'm sure that most of us have grown quite accustomed to these Zoom formats these days. But in case that this is one of your very first meetings, I want to let you know of a few things. One is that there are multiple viewing options. So you can go to either speaker view in the top right corner if you're on a computer, speaker view, or the gallery view. The gallery view is going to kind of give you that Hollywood Squares style, and the speaker view will be largely just our speaker. It activates the camera of the microphone that is speaking. So that's an option for you. Another piece here is that we kindly request that you remain muted for the entirety of the program. You'll see that even if you try to unmute, I don't think you will be able to do so. But if you are able to do so, we ask that you kindly just stay muted for our time together today. We are expecting to conclude our time together right around 3:15 Eastern, 10:15 Jerusalem time. We'll be saving the last 15 minutes for a question and answer session with our speaker, Yair Lootsteen. And we ask that you please pose your questions in the Zoom chat box. So I will be compiling and curating the questions beginning right around an hour in, but right around 3 p.m. Eastern. But please feel free to send in your questions at any time during the presentation. And feel free to write a private message directly to me. Again, that's Rabbi Zachary Goodman, or you can post it in the chat box for everyone. Lastly, we recognize that when we speak about Israel, we always have incredibly varied and passionate opinions and experiences. So we ask that you enter to this learning space together with respect for one another and with the primary intent of listening and learning. Without any further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Yair Lootsteen. He is the chairperson of Israel's Movement for Progressive Judaism, the Israeli Reform Movement, known as IMPJ. He has been on the IMPJ board since 2013 and currently also serves on the IMPJ board's Congregational Development Committee and as a member of the Reform Movement's Israel Religious Action Committee Steering Committee. Born in London, England, Yair grew up in Toronto, Canada, and he made Aliyah in 1979 and has resided in Jerusalem since. A lawyer, Yair served in the IDF's Military Advocate General Corps for 23 years, completing his term of duty in 2007 with the rank of colonel. During his military career, he has held several challenging positions, the last being that of the legal advisor to the IDF in Judea and Samaria. Previous positions in the IDF included that of a staff judge advocate for the General Staff Command and the legal advisor to the IDF in the Gaza Strip. Since completing his regular IDF service, Yair has invested much of his time on issues relating to Jewish pluralism in Israel. From 2010 to 2013, he served as president of Kehilat Kol HaNeshama, Jerusalem's largest Reform synagogue, and continues to be an active member of the synagogue. Yair also serves as ex officio on the executive board of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, and as a member of the Israel team of Artseinu, the International Federation of Reform and Progressive Religious Zionists. In that later capacity, from 2012 to 2015, he served as co-chair of the World Zionist Organization's Standing Committee on Budget and Finance, and since late 2015 has been a board member of the Keren Kayemet LeIsrael, the Jewish National Fund. In May of 2018, he was appointed vice chairman of Kakal JNF. Yair continues to serve in the IDF as a reservist, and until recently was also a regular columnist for the Canadian Jewish News. Yair Lootsteen is married to Hannah, and they have 2 children, Naomi and Natan. So without any further delays, we welcome you, Yair. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
So good evening or good afternoon to all of you from Jerusalem. It's a real thrill for me to any interaction with the Canadian Jewish community is always wonderful for me. Brings back a lot of fond memories, and I know I see friends, valued friends, dear friends amongst us here, people that I've met during my journey within Reform Judaism, Progressive Judaism, and it's wonderful to be here at Holy Blossom and with Arts of Canada. I want to tell you a roadmap of what I'm going to try to talk about this evening, and I'm happy to answer questions, and please do ask the questions in the chat, and I'll try if I can pick them up also during my talk. But I want to also make a proviso, a caveat to begin with. As many of you know, the issue of the annexation is being put on the back burner in many senses. In Israel, it certainly has been, and it being such a political hot potato, it was decided to, for the time being, in our political world, it is no longer, does not seem to be relevant. And as things get closer to the American election season, or deeper into the American election season, it seems that it's now more or less a moot issue. So I will try to reach that. I hope I'm not disappointing any of you. I will try to reach that issue as we move forward towards the end of our discussion, if I have time. But I thought that I would introduce you a little bit to the geography of the West Bank. I apologize in advance to some of you who probably know it better than others, but I think it's important that we're all on the same sheet of music. And then I'll try to acquaint you, as you might have heard in the intro from Rabbi Zachary, that I served for about 23 years in the Military Advocate General's Corps of the IDF, and my last position was that of the legal advisor to the IDF in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. And I would like to share with you some of the challenges and some of the war stories that I took part in while I was in that position, and also to discuss some of the specific issues that continue to worry and require the attention of the legal advisors to the IDF. So I'm going to share for the first 5 minutes or so. I'm going to share a bunch of maps so that we all get to see the geography. So forgive me as I now share the document. So here, this is what I'm going to be discussing. I even found some logos of some different places. The IDF logos for the Military Advocate General's Corps, and for the IDF in general, the Israeli Movement for Reform and Progressive Judaism, Arts of Canada, and of course, our gracious host, Holy Blossom. Again, for some of the people who know me from the past, they'll be surprised. I'm trying to now move there. So this is how I looked when I was inducted. So I did have some hair. My good friend Les Rothschild, who is here, I did have some hair, and this is me getting the rank of colonel from then Chief of Staff, Moshe Boogie Ayalon, who was later the Minister of Defense, my wife and 2 children, and my father, who was very proud that day. Being a Holocaust survivor, I think it was a big thrill for him. Giving myself a little bit of nachas, I'm going to move on. So let's talk a little bit. Let's try to acquaint ourselves with the geography. And here we're seeing. I assume that you can see the cursor that I'm showing you here. We're seeing the green line, and basically pre-1967 Israel. We're seeing Eilat, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Netanya, and the areas that are not under Israeli control at that time and are now the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Of course, the Sinai Peninsula. And here we just get a better vision of that, or a different vision of that in English as well. And you see Gaza Strip, West Bank, Golan Heights. Okay, and we're going to move forward. Again, any questions that you have, I'm happy to answer as we move forward, also on the geography. So this is now getting a little bit bigger, Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And when we talk about any connection for a Palestinian state, of these two Palestinian autonomous areas, it's important to note, again, I'm probably saying things that you all know, that they're not contiguous, so that there's no, there's an issue of how do you get people from Gaza to the West Bank, and we'll talk about that perhaps as we move forward. Again, this is a very important map, and this will be something that's central to my discussion also from a legal point of view. This is a map that shows you the red lines here are the red line of the security barrier that the IDF established to try to avoid having terrorists enter into Israel. This is during the Second Intifada. We'll talk about that a little bit earlier, but the map shows something much more important. The map shows this is all the West Bank. Again, you're seeing here the West Bank, Jerusalem in the middle, which is Jerusalem is not in the West Bank. And we're seeing, oops, pardon me, I went one too far. I'm gonna go back one. And what we're seeing here is the map of the Oslo Accord, okay? Oslo Accord signed in 1994. And what we're seeing here is what the Oslo Accord established, which is areas A, B, and C in the West Bank. Area A are the brown spots on this map, okay? Oh, but maybe I'll step back one step backwards as well. Again, you hear things in the news. So when you hear about Jenin is up here, up in the north. It's the northern part of Samaria, of Shomron in Hebrew, as we call it. You've got Tulkarem and you've got Kalkilia on the west side of the West Bank. You've got Nablus, which is one of the major cities, Nablus here, one of the largest Palestinian cities in the West Bank. You've got Jericho here on the east. You've got Ramallah El Bira just north of Jerusalem. You've got Bethlehem south of Jerusalem, and you've got Hebron even further south in the southernmost part of the West Bank. Again, I'll go back to the colors scheme that we see here, which is a result of the Oslo Accords. We've got areas A. Area A, according to the Oslo Accord, areas A were areas that were both the security authority and the civilian authority were transferred by the Israeli military government to the Palestinian Authority, i.e. in the areas that are brown, the Palestinian Authority is responsible for everything from school curriculums and medical care and giving licenses to cars to security-related issues, soldiers who have guns and or policemen who have guns and who do crime intervention, and are also responsible for the security issues in the cities that they control. You can see that most of areas A are urban areas. If I mentioned before, Jenin, Kalkilia, Nablus, Ramallah, and it's all the cities that I mentioned before are all mostly in the brown areas, which are areas A, where the largest Palestinian populations are. The yellow pieces, okay, are areas B. Areas B are areas in which the Palestinians have civilian control, i.e. all of those civilian issues that I mentioned before, schooling, healthcare, licensing, zoning, everything to do with civilian matters. But the IDF is responsible for security in that area. Okay, so if someone throws a stone at an Israeli driving through this area, the IDF soldiers can run after that person, arrest him, detain him, and have him put on trial in an Israeli military court. We'll talk about that as we move forward. And last but not least, areas C. Everything that's white in this map, is the areas where most of the Israeli settlements are, okay? And that is areas that is under Israeli military control. It's not Israel. It's not Israel in the sense of from a legal point of view. I'm trying not to be political in this talk. I'm talking about the legal side of things. From a legal point of view, Israel has not annexed this area. And as a result, the laws that apply to this area are the laws of the military government in the West Bank. I'm going to stop the share and now move back to some of the legal issues. I don't know whether do we have any questions yet on this, Rabbi Zachary? Any questions that anyone might have? If not, then I'm just going to continue. All right?
Please continue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I want to expose you to some to the role of the military advocate general in the West Bank, and then to expose you to several specific legal issues that I have dealt with, and I know that I'll call it the MAG Corps, Military Advocate General Corps in Judea and Samaria, has been tasked with and it continues to be tasked with. And I like to say that the legal front of matters in the West Bank and in general in Israel are especially in times of conflict, are one of the it's now even got a term of art called lawfare as opposed to warfare, and it's one of the major issues that needs to be discussed in any times of conflict. After the military issues, diplomatic, media, and humanitarian fronts, the legal front is definitely definitely something that is important to understand. So just to understand a little bit about the law in the West Bank, we need to also understand sources of law in the West Bank. And I like to categorize the sources of law as 7 different sources. I know it sounds complicated, but I'll try to make it as easy as possible. 4 of which are chronological, and I'll explain why. And 3 others are more substantive in nature, and we'll talk about each one of them. So chronologically, I want to go back to an era when the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, ruled Israel, ruled the land of Israel. And till today, there are Ottoman laws that still exist in the law books of the West Bank, and by the way, also in Israel. One important area of law is land law. Major sections of the West Bank's land law is still Turkish law from the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And if we have time, I'll give you some examples of that. After the Turks in 1917, the British moved in. But the British it was a British mandate that existed there, and the British left a body of law that they created between 1917 and 1948, a very important body of law. Until today, some of those laws continue to exist. Some of the most draconian laws in the West Bank's law books continue to exist. I'll give you an example. When you hear at times about the homes of Palestinian terrorists being destroyed, that is done under authority that exists under the British emergency regulations of 1945. That's an example. That's the second chronological source of law. The third chronological source of law is the Jordanian law. The Jordanians controlled the West Bank from 1948 to 1967, and they also left a body of law, some of which still exists. One important area of law that the Jordanians left was zoning law. And that is important because some of that zoning law still exists within Israeli settlements in the West Bank and in the Palestinian territories within the West Bank. Last but not least, from a chronological point of view, is everything that the Israeli military government has passed since 1967. Many years now, almost 55 years, 53 years since we conquered or liberated, depending how you want to, or occupied. And again, I'm not going to take it to the political side, but I'm going to describe it how different people describe it. Since we took control of and began administrating the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, again, not using them in any political sense. I'm trying to be very, very cautious with that in this conversation. But Israeli military law is not Israeli law. It's not laws passed by the military, by the Knesset, by our parliament, but rather laws and ordinances that are promulgated by the military commander of the West Bank. The head of the central command of the West Bank is the chief. He's the one who signs off on the laws that exist in the West Bank since 1967, the new laws. And there's hundreds of laws that were promulgated and drafted and promulgated during the 55 odd years since the beginning of our administration there in many areas of law. Okay? Those are the 4 chronological areas of law. I want to talk about 3 others. One of them is Israeli administrative law. Early on in the early 70s, late 60s and early 70s, the Israeli government decided to allow Palestinians living in the West Bank access to the Israeli administrative law system. That meant that the Palestinians could petition against actions of the military government to Israeli tribunals and courts, challenging those actions in Israeli courts, including in the Israeli Supreme Court. And we'll talk about the role of the Israeli Supreme Court in this area as we move forward. Secondly, it's important to talk about public international law, which is the law of belligerent occupation and the law of warfare. We're talking about the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Regulations of 1907. I'm trying not to go into too many details because I'm assuming that most of the folks on this talk are not lawyers. But it's important to understand that Israel, while some from a political point of view will say it's not an area that's occupied under the Geneva Conventions, from a legal point of view, Israel has recognized the jurisdiction of the Geneva, specifically the 4th Geneva Convention, which deals with occupied territories and provides protection for civilians living in areas that have been occupied. And so that is another area of law that is important. And last but not least of the 7 sources is what I call conventional law. Convention in the sense of covenants. And one of the most important ones in this respect is the same Oslo Accord that I mentioned earlier when I was describing the map. It is an agreement that the Israeli government, came to with the PLO during Yitzhak Rabin, Zichrono Livracha's prime ministership. And the regulations in that accord apply from a conventional point of view between Israel and the Palestinians, and apply and for instance, that whole regime of areas A, B, and C was established in accordance to the Oslo Accord. Okay, I'll move it forward again.
Here, there is a question about Area C.
Yes.
So Steve asks if Area C extends through to Qumran, Masada, Kibbutz Ein Gedi, and En Bukek.
Well, Kibbutz Ein Gedi is in Israel proper. Qumran is in Area C. I don't remember the other areas that were mentioned, but most of the kibbutzim.
Masada as well.
Masada is in Israel. Masada is south of the border. If we go back, if you know what, I'll try to show the screen again of the map, but Masada is in Israel proper, so is En Gedi, okay? If you go down the Jordan Valley Rift, you come to a point where there's roadblocks, etc., and that is when you cross from, if you're going through Jerusalem, you go from Israel into the West Bank and down through the Jordan Valley, through the West Bank, and then into the back into Israel. So at some point, there are parts of the Jordan Valley that are in the West Bank, but for the most part, the places that Steve mentioned are areas that are in Israel. Okay, I'm going to move. Is it okay to move forward? Is there any other questions on the geography? There's
another question, but I think it's a great question for question and answer section. So keep on going. Thank you.
All right. So I think it's important to describe the importance of the Israeli High Court of Justice and uh, um, the decision of the Israeli government to allow Palestinians access to the Supreme Court. It's not a given. It's when I describe this. I spent a year of my military career representing Israel in the American Army. I went to the JAG school of the American Army for a year as a lieutenant colonel at the time. And when I described the role of the Israeli Supreme Court allowing Palestinians who feel that they've been treated in an illegal manner by the military government and being able to petition and appeal the actions of the military directly to the Supreme Court, they're shocked. And I'll describe some of the actions even in times of warfare to understand just how involved the Supreme Court can be in the matters of the military government. And it's not a given that a Palestinian can go directly to the Supreme Court. It's something that I'm not sure whether it exists in Canada, but when I describe it to my friends, the Americans, they say, like, how can someone in an occupied territory, is not even an area that is actually Israel, have direct access to the courts in general in Israel, and certainly to the Supreme Court. And the actions of the Supreme Court and the rulings of the Supreme Court are very, very important in establishing the rule of law. And the court sees itself as something that's very central in ensuring, and in some ways, making certain that the military government is within the tenets of law in general. And I think that it adds credence to the actions of the military in the West Bank. I want to give you. So what is the role of the legal advisor? I was the legal advisor to the IDF in the West Bank. It's to ensure that the actions and activities of all IDF functionaries in the West Bank are executed legally, and if and when any of their actions are challenged, to provide good legal defense for them. And I think that is something that is a very important position to have, having held it. It's also important to understand, and again, I don't know how it works in the Canadian military. I've had interaction with some of the Canadian JAGs, who are excellent JAGs, by the way. But I know that the American JAGs, for instance, are all a JAG officer is subservient to the military commander. So a general who is not a lawyer can give an order to a lawyer. In the IDF, the lawyers are independent. So when I was providing legal advice to the head of a very high-ranking general, and I was only a colonel, he could not tell me what to do. He could ask me for my legal opinion, but my boss sat in Tel Aviv, who was the chief lawyer for the military. And it's a very important position, important statement to say that what really rules from my point of view is the law. And I think that is a very important statement to be made. It also makes the position of the lawyers very tenuous at times, because sometimes those lawyers are considered to be folks who put sticks in the spokes of the military, who want to move forward more quickly. But I think in the end, and I'll give some citations as we move forward, it's very important for the rule of law and for the military to be acting only in legal ways. Okay? I want to give you, I could describe to you who my clients were, but I won't, because I'm not sure whether it would mean a lot to you, but it's the different divisions and brigades and the civil administration, which runs much of the civilian actions of both Israeli settlers and Palestinians, and who now coordinate actions between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli military government. For instance, how do Palestinians who want to work in Israel get licenses for that? That's through the civil administration. How is produce moved from one area to another when areas are closed, etc.? That's all run by the civil administration, and there's all kinds of legal actions that arise. There's a police district, an Israeli police district, And I was also involved in giving them. When I say myself, it's important to understand that I wasn't doing this alone. I had a team of 30 lawyers working for me, all young Israeli military lawyers from the rank of from a colonel as myself, all the way down to a first lieutenant or second lieutenant, a full lieutenant. I want to give you, and I also had the opportunity to work very closely with the Shin Bet on some of the issues the security related issues, some sensitive issues that arose. And I want to describe to you a little bit about I talked about war stories, and I'll try to describe a couple of war stories as we move forward. So I want to take you back to 2001 and 2002. I became the legal advisor I was deputy legal advisor. I'll take it one step back. Sorry, apologize. But in the year 1999-2000, I was sent to the United States to be in the JAG Advocate General's Corps of the U.S. Army. And when on my way back to Israel, I was told that I was going to be given the position of deputy legal advisor in the West Bank with the hope of replacing the existing legal advisor and getting the rank of colonel. And I would probably be the last legal advisor, the military legal advisor, because peace was about to break out between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. It's the time when Barak and Arafat were meeting to try to come to a final status agreement. And that all exploded in October of 2000, and just as I returned back to Israel and took on the position, when the second Intifada began. And things came to a head in March, a year later, when, and I'll remind you, if you perhaps have forgotten, it was a time of suicide bombers. On a daily basis, any of us who were living in Israel would wake up and hear that a suicide bomber had exploded himself in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, in one of the settlements. And things came to a head in March of 2000 of that year, when upwards of 130 Israelis, both soldiers and civilians, were killed by suicide bombers. You know, till today, when I see certain bus stops in and around Jerusalem where I live, I remember that buses exploded at those bus stops. People today don't realize, my own kids don't realize it when they get on the bus, but it was a real time when parents were very, very weary of sending their kids to school or anywhere else on the buses. And things came to an absolute head at the end of March of that year, when on Erev Pesach in Netanya, some of you might know where Netanya is. It's just north of Jerusalem, of Tel Aviv. A group of Israeli families were preparing for the Seder, a communal Seder, in the lobby of the Park Hotel in Netanya, when a suicide bomber, who we later knew was from a town called Tulkarem in the West Bank, walked into the place and blew himself up, killing upwards of 30 people on that night. And as a result of that action, our government decided to change the policy. The government at the time, Ariel Sharon's government, decided to change its policy regarding entrance into Areas A. Remember I mentioned to you Areas A, B, and C? So Areas A were areas that the Palestinians had full military and security as well as civilian control. And our government came to the conclusion that they had taken advantage of the fact that we allowed them under the Oslo Accord to have full military control of those areas, and they developed terrorist activities. And people were being killed as a result of being sent out as suicide bombers from those areas into Israel. And the government decided overnight to do away with Areas A, B, and C. Basically, it was a big shock to anyone who was involved in the legal community at the time, because we saw it as something sacred. But from a security point of view, the government said, we just can't live with this at the time. And so there was a mass mobilization of forces. Many reservists were called in, and we went into areas A, B, and C. We took over control of areas A. We went into Nablus and Jenin and to Ramallah and Elbiria, Hebron and Bethlehem, and retook those areas. And some of the areas there was we ended up arresting hundreds and thousands of people within 5 weeks. And again, I'm coming to the point of this discussion, of this particular part of the discussion. Within 5 weeks, 7,000 Palestinians had been arrested. Now, as a lawyer, this is where the lawyers come into play. Any of you who might be lawyers in the room, and I say in this room in the figurative sense, will know that if you arrest someone, you have to within a certain period of time, he has to be brought before a judge. And the question was, first of all, what do you do with 7,000 people? Where do you put them? There was not prisons for 7,000 people. That is a whole other kettle of fish that I'm going to put on the back burner right now, although it was a major legal issue as to the conditions within the places that we were holding people. But the question that I want to bring forward before you is, what do you do with so many detainees? And could we, and by the way, under the law that existed at that time, it's changed since then, prisoners or detainees had to be brought before a judge within 8 days in the West Bank. While in Israel, at the time, it was 48 hours and later became 24 hours. At the time, the military had 8 days to bring people before a judge. And it quickly became clear that it was impossible to bring people before judges within those 8 days. There were not enough judges, there were not enough interrogators, there were not enough policemen. It was just impossible. It was not going to be possible. And as a result, as I mentioned before, the military commander has authority to legislate, and we legislated a law that established the opportunity or the fact that we could lengthen that period of time at first to 18 days. I'm not saying it's pretty. I'm just saying that this is what existed, because we couldn't have to sift through all those people. You arrested them because you wanted to stop the suicide bombings and the terrorism that existed at the time. And we didn't, and 18 days were not enough as well, and we had to get to 30 days. Okay? And that we were attacked in the courts about that. We went, people, civil human rights organizations challenged us in the courts. I'll talk about that separately. But the question is, once we have those 30 days, what do we do with the folks that are the people, the terrorists, the civilians that were arrested? So first and foremost, the easiest thing would be to release them. People that you've sifted through and decided that they should be released and sent home. But that turned out to be a little bit difficult as well. And I remember we were working around, the lawyers were working around the clock as well, because there was issues that arose on a minute by minute matter. I'm not going into some of the minutiae in that, but so we had people on duty throughout the week. On weekends, it was a war. There was a war going on, and we wanted to release a group of 250 prisoners who people had come to the understanding that they were no longer necessary for detention, and some of their lawyers got wind of that fact. And I remember getting a call from one of those lawyers saying, "What are you? Are you a Michigana? You're going to let those people go? You're just going to open up the gates of the camp and let them go? There's a war going on. You have a legal responsibility to the safety of those folks and getting them home." And they were right. So we kept them in for another day. We got the UN, something called the UN Vocational Service involved. We ended up taking those 250 people to UN vocational schools and dropped them off there, and they eventually could go home to get when things got a little quieter in the battle zones that were raging at the time. So those are people going home who had nothing. We had nothing to do with. And then it soon became clear that anyone who's a lawyer, but you don't even have to be a lawyer. The way that you deal with criminals is you put them on trial in criminal criminal offenses, and then you need to have a file is created about each one of those folks. Did you lose me for a second, or did I lose you? Or are you hearing me, Rabbi Zachary?
We got you. Keep going. Yeah, there was a little bit. We're doing well. Thank you. Keep going.
Okay. So what do you do with folks? You put them on trial, but to put people on trial, you've got to create an investigatory file, and you've got to bring them before to have them investigated. You've got to have a prosecutor. You've got to have a judge, and that was a difficult time. And the issue was that some of the information that you had about those people was intelligence information. So there was a decision to make use of something called administrative detentions. At this point in most of my lectures on this issue, I asked folks if they could describe to me what an administrative detention is. But we're not going to do it in this form with 84 people listening to this lecture. Administrative detentions are when you have credible intelligence, and we'll talk about that someone is a potentially dangerous security risk, and that for reasons that have to do with the source of information you have about that person, the information cannot be brought before a court. We have a system through which, in the military, people can be detained administratively. Now, what is the kind of information that you can have? You can have something called human intelligence, when you have people who have provided information about someone who's saying, this person is organizing folks to throw Molotov cocktails along the road at soldiers and civilians. This person is involved in some sort of a terror cell and the information is, by the way, if that human intelligence becomes known, then that person obviously would not be a person by the time that the sunset was on that evening. So you've got to protect that human intelligence. The other forms of intelligence are SIGINT, which is signal intelligence, and I leave it to your imagination to figure out what signal intelligence might be. You've got visit. Today, it's much more prevalent. You've got visual intelligence, which are all the cameras that you've got, the closed circuit cameras that are everywhere. And at the time, it was less prevalent. And today, you've also got what we call open, which is open intelligence, which is intelligence that you can get through social media. And so, how does that work? There's a process. Not that someone decides that this guy's not a good guy, and you've got some information about him, but the Shin Bet is involved in that. The Shin Bet develops a file on someone and says, this person, we have credible information that's several sources saying this guy is a public danger to society from a security point of view. He's going to be involved in some sort of terrorist activity, and if we provide information about that person in an open court, we would make that the source of that information would be endanger folks in the future if that information, or the way we got that information, was revealed in an open court. And the length of time that the Shin Bet can ask to have someone detained is up to 6 months in an administrative detention. That detention is then reviewed by military lawyers, and it has to be brought before a court. Now, it's not in a regular court, but the judges will see the information. The defense attorney will not see all of the intelligence information, the confidential information, but the courts will, and the court decision can be appealed to a higher court, and eventually can be appealed also to the Supreme Court. And in one of the years of the Second Intifada, there was over 500 cases brought by Palestinians directly to the Supreme Court regarding their administrative detentions. Now, this might sound like a very draconian act, and it is, and it's important to describe it as such. But I want, I want to challenge any one of you to tell me. And by the way, after 6 months, if that person is still a security risk, that detention can be lengthened for another period of time, up to and it can be renewed every 6 months. There's very few that are renewed on a regular basis. There have been in the history of Israeli administrative detention in the West Bank, folks that Palestinians who have been detained for up to almost 5 years under administrative detentions, very draconian, and something that I like to unfortunately say is a necessary evil in some cases. But I want to challenge you and ask you that if you have information that someone is going to blow himself up, and that the information that you have about that person is received through sources of intelligence that cannot be revealed in an open court, how long would you keep him under detention? Is he worth 6 months? Is he worth a year? When do you say that that danger is no longer exists? Is he old enough now to understand that he shouldn't blow himself up? Those are the responsibilities that lie on the lawyer's shoulders. I want to now take you. I know that we've got another 9 minutes, Rabbi Zachary, and I want to go through one other war story, and I'll try to get to some of the annexation piece as well, maybe in the question and answer. So I want to talk about another issue besides the issues of detainees. There's also issues of actual warfare, and if you remember, the Second Intifada and the warfare that existed was Operation Defensive Shield at the time, and many legal issues arose at the time regarding the means and methods of warfare. I'll give you an example. There was at the beginning of that operation, and I'll put a focus on an area called the Jenin refugee camp. At the beginning, there was major battles within the Jenin refugee camps, and we used Cobra. The IDF used Cobra helicopter ships to attack specific targets, and that was challenged in the Supreme Court, saying that there was too many people being killed as collateral damage. And we were taken to the Supreme Court, and our Supreme Court required us to gave us 12 hours before having to appear before the court, saying we want to understand why you're using Cobra warships. The same is true about the use of other means and methods within warfare. But I want to, since time is running out, I want to give you the biggest example of the time, which was major battles were taking place in the Jenin refugee camp. I was finally home one Friday afternoon. My wife sent me off to take my daughter to a birthday party. She was 5 years old at the time. And as I'm at the birthday party, I'm starting to get calls on my antiquated cell phone. We're talking about early 2002, and I'm hearing that there are rumors that there was a massacre of Palestinians in the Jenin refugee camp, and that there's claims by the international media that this is a second Sabra in Shatila. If any of you remember Beirut in the 80s, that there's hundreds of Palestinians killed, that Israel has killed hundreds of Palestinians, and that there are several, excuse me for a second, there are several members of Knesset, Arab members of Knesset, who are threatening to take the matter to the Supreme Court, saying that the battle should be stopped in Jenin. And this is a Friday afternoon. I realized at some point that I need to get to the state attorney's office in Jerusalem, and I phone my wife and tell her that she has to arrange for my daughter to get home somewhere else in a different way. And by the time I get to the state attorney's office, 2 petitions have been submitted to the Supreme Court on a Friday afternoon. The duty judge is a Orthodox judge who it's Shabbat is coming in. He says, I'd like the state to give us their response as to what is going on in Jenin before that Shabbat comes in. And we start to try to get the information together, understanding what's happening. And we understand that there's battles still going on in Jenin, that there are Palestinians who have been killed, that during the battles, Israelis were killed as well, and that we don't have full information yet, but there's certainly, we're getting information that some of the bodies of Palestinians have been booby-trapped, and that we cannot stop the battles, and we cannot allow Palestinian Red Crescent to move in because that would be endangering them. And it was also very difficult to do it because there was battles still going on. Shabbat comes in, the case is moved over to the Chief Justice at the time, Aaron Barak, and we submit the our first submission to the court just after Shabbat comes in, saying that we know of roughly 30 people who have been killed on the Palestinian side, that there's pockets of resistance still going on, and that things, we cannot stop the battle. There's no way of stopping the battle. We will do so. We will evacuate, that there are not hundreds of bodies strewn across the area. And lo and behold, at 9:30 in the evening, Barak issues an order to stop the battle, that he will have a hearing about this matter Sunday morning. I had the misfortune of having to tell the head of the Central Command that he had to stop a war because the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court ordered the battles to stop. Sunday morning, by the way, Saturday, another lawyer phones me at home saying that he's got wind of the fact that there are many homes that have been destroyed. There are all across the refugee camp. There's hundreds of people buried under the wrecks of buildings, and he demands that we send in the home front command to go over the entire refugee camp to see if there are bodies. And I phone the military commanders who say, tell them to tell us where exactly they're hearing sounds, and we'll send in forces to try to get the folks out. That is not I tell that lawyer that. The lawyer says that's not good enough. And he on a Shabbat afternoon, he submits another petition to the Supreme Court. The next day, Sunday, is an absolute. The head of the Central Command, a man running a war at the time, comes to the Justice Ministry in Jerusalem to discuss the case. At that point, we knew that there was roughly 50 Palestinians killed in the battle. That we were. By the way, it's the days are the days of a Chamsin, the hottest days of the year. We get some of our hottest weather at the beginning of towards the end of spring and the beginning of the fall. Absolutely hot weather, a public health issue because there's bodies strewn. We're told not to touch the bodies. And the military brings in refrigerator trucks to deal with the bodies once we're allowed to get them out. And then the head of the Central Command said, I can't go to the court. I refuse to go to the court. I've got a war to run. And we get to the court, and there's an absolute circus. As we're sitting there and the proceedings begin, a reservist major comes walking in with his uniform, his red paratrooper shoes on, and he points to the Supreme Court, the head of the Supreme Court. He says, I demand to speak here, Mr. Barak. You endangered me for the last 36 hours because of your stupid order. I had to stand with my soldiers in the refugee camp, endangering them. We were sitting ducks. How dare you do that? And Barak said to him, thank you, sir. Please have a seat. Second person there was a fellow by the name of Benny Avraham. Benny Avraham was the father of a soldier, of one of three soldiers who had been abducted by the Hezbollah just at the beginning of the Second Intifada into Lebanon. And there was, at the time, it was not certain whether those three boys were alive or dead. And he said, what do you even, and he said, I demand to speak before the court as well. What are you talking about? And Barak said to him, please, sir, have your word. And he said, how could you even think about releasing these fellows from the bodies of these terrorists when I don't know what's happened to my son. At the end of the day, and Barak said to him, please have a seat. I have many other stories to tell, but I'll tell you what Barak wrote that afternoon. He wrote the following, and then I'll give you two other examples. I've still got my 2 minutes to go, don't I, Zach? So yes, so this is what he wrote. He says, Barak wrote that same afternoon. It was claimed in the petitions that a massacre had been committed in the Jenin refugee camp. The respondents, that is the state, disagree most strongly. In Jenin, there was a battle in which many of our soldiers fell. The army fought from house to house, not by bombing from the air, in order to prevent to the extent possible civilian casualties. 23 IDF soldiers lost their lives in those battles. Scores of soldiers were wounded. The petitioners, that's the Palestinians, did not lift the burden of evidence which laid on their soldiers. A massacre is one thing, a difficult battle is something else. And again, the respondents, the state, repeat their claim before us that they wish to hide nothing and that they have nothing to hide. And we suggested at the time that some pragmatic solution would be set into place the minute that we could do so. I want to give you two final examples before I open it, and I apologize that I'm going to take 2 minutes, 3 extra minutes, Rabbi Goodman. And I want to talk to you about two other cases and give you citations from two other cases that I think will give you an example of some of the dilemmas that we as a democracy, with the security issues that we have to deal with, even from a legal point of view. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Israel was the only Western democracy that admitted that in some cases it used a modicum of physical force when interrogating people in situations that were called at the time ticking time bombs. When the information existed saying that someone had information about a terrorist act that was imminent, that was about to happen, and that if the only way you could get that information was using a modicum of physical force against that person, Israel admitted that it did so to get that information to save lives. And that was an organization called the Public Committee Against Torture took that matter to the Supreme Court. And the same Aaron Barak, the Chief Justice, wrote the following words. He said, and by the way, he decided that the Shin Bet, this is not a military issue, but the Shin Bet issue, the Shin Bet could no longer use that modicum of force. And he wrote the following: this is the destiny of a democracy. It does not see all means as acceptable, and the ways of its enemies are not always open before it. A democracy must sometimes fight with one hand tied behind its back. Even so, a democracy has the upper hand. The rule of law and the liberty of the individual constitute important components in its understanding of security. At the end of the day, they strengthen its spirit, and this strength allows it to overcome its difficulties. And last but not least, I want to give you a final example, and I apologize, Rabbi, for taking another minute, is another case in which I was involved with a few years later during that second intifada as well, in which the military had a procedure called neighbor procedure. Sometimes our soldiers go into areas that are not particularly welcoming to arrest folks in their homes. And so as not to have to go in with full force into some of those homes, there was a procedure in which the military asked the military commanders present at the spot who had surrounded the home would knock at the door of a neighbor and ask that neighbor to knock at the door of the suspected terrorist, saying that he should come out because otherwise the soldiers were coming in and he might get killed. and that it would be better for him to give himself up. And several human rights organizations took the military, the IDF, to court, saying that was an illegitimate and illegal manner of putting that neighbor in harm's way and using him for military purposes that were illegal. And it was taken to Supreme Court in 2 rounds in the Supreme Court. And the Deputy Chief Justice at the time, Michael Cheshin, wrote the following. And I'll complete my talk with that for now. And I apologize for not getting to the annexation. He wrote the following. The subject, and by the way, he decided that neighbor procedure was illegal, that we could no longer use that. And he said the subject is a difficult one, most difficult. So difficult is it that a judge might ask himself why he chose the calling of the judiciary and not of another profession to be busy with. Woe is me, for I answer to my Creator. Woe is me with my conflicting inclinations. And this is something that's beautiful in some of our rulings in the Supreme Court. And then he cites the Babylonian Talmud on that matter. No matter which solution I choose, the time will come that I will regret my choice. Indeed, there is no clear legal rule to show us the way, and I shall decide according to my own way of legal reasoning. I think that the importance of having the Supreme Court overseeing the actions of the military in manners in which the court is involved on a daily basis on matters that are important on a legal and security point of view is something central to the tenets of the Israeli democracy. I'm very proud of the way that works. I think that Israel can be proud, the IDF can be proud, and I think the people who support Israel, and whether you agree with the occupation or don't agree with the occupation, I think that this is an important piece. I'll stop with that, and if there's any other questions that have come up, Rabbi Goodman, I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. We do have a handful of questions, and I'm going to do my best to try to pair some of them so that we can hear as many responses, and I do apologize. I think that we have just a few more questions than we're going to have time for responses.
By the way, if anyone is, I'm willing to stay on. If anyone wants to stay on, it's up to you. You're running the show.
Great. So we'll just ask all of the questions, and if you need to run, we completely understand. So let me begin. There was a question posed, and I'm going to see if I can put these two together. A question posed about the legal status of the Golan Heights, and if that's the same as the West Bank. And then.
So let me answer that already. It's not the same. It is the same from an international legal point of view, but as opposed to the West Bank, Israel officially, from a domestic law point of view, annexed the Golan Heights. Okay, so while the Golan Heights belonged to Syria up till the 6-Day War, Israel decided in 1980, if I'm not mistaken, during the Begin government, Menachem Begin's government, to annex that territory. That annexation has not been recognized by any state in the world. Only recently it was to some degree recognized by the American administration, Trump's American administration. So there's a complete difference from an Israeli domestic point of view. We have not, Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights is legal, and the laws of the Israeli laws apply to the Golan Heights, whereas they don't apply directly to the areas of the West Bank.
Fantastic. So then, on that point, another question was posed about the laws, right? About the laws. So, which of those 7 legal frameworks that you described earlier does the UN and the ICC recognize? Or do they recognize?
So that is a lawyer's question, and I'm happy to have that conversation. The ICC, the ICC would certainly say that international law is applied. It also recognizes that the Israeli Supreme Court, one of the ICC is the International Criminal Court, and that's a whole other area. And when we talked about lawfare as opposed to warfare, that is an area in which many Israeli military commanders find themselves threatened with international criminal proceedings. But the ICC, I think, does it see the settlements as legal or not? There's specific issues that need to be recognized. I think that there's no question that the 4 chronological sources of law apply to the West Bank. Certainly, international law applies, the public international law. Certainly, I don't think the ICC would say that conventional law does not apply. And there might be a question as to Israeli administrative law, but I'm happy to have a conversation with the lawyer who asked that question.
Sure. So another question back to connecting the Golan Heights and West Bank. The question was posed, I'm just going to read it directly as it was written so I don't misconstrue. Given the rather meek response from the international community to annexing the Golan, what makes the issue a hot potato with the West Bank settlements, e.g. Ma'al Adumim?
Okay, so I have a whole series of maps that I prepared for the annexation question, and I don't think we're going to get to that because it's a long question. One of the issues that arises regarding the West Bank annexation is how much Israel plans to annex. Is it planning to annex a little sliver of land, or is it planning to annex a larger sliver of land? And how many Israelis would be within that area? But perhaps more importantly is the issue of how many Palestinians would be within that area. And whereas the Golan Heights has four Syrian Druze communities in it, people who lived in Syria beforehand, and with several thousands of people. And at the time, there was a meek response. That's true, although there was some public debate about it internationally. And to today, no one recognized it. The Israeli, internationally, it's not recognized. The issue I think that arises about the West Bank is that it's looked upon as something that might put an end to the possibility of reaching a political or diplomatic agreement between ourselves and the Palestinians about Palestinian nationhood. I think that for many people around the world, the declarations made by some of the politicians in Israel, headed by our current Prime Minister, Netanyahu, who said that if Palestinians were going to be within the areas annexed, that they would not be provided full political rights. I think that's an issue as well, because the folks in the Golan Heights who wanted to become Israeli citizens could apply for Israeli citizenship, and here we're basically, what Netanyahu said he actually means, that Palestinians in areas that would be annexed in the West Bank would have to continue receiving many of their services from the Palestinian Authority. What does that mean for the type of sovereignty or that was going to be applied to that area? Was there going to be full political rights for everyone in that areas? And I think that is an issue. I'm not sure whether I've given a good enough answer to that, but I'm happy to continue the discussion on it.
Sure. So there was a question posed on a similar, let me see if I can find it here. This is posed by Noah on a similar thread. So the full annexation of the West Bank may be moot and undesirable. However, given the suspension of security coordination with the PA in May and previous thorny cooperation, is there any value to the annexation? In previous thorny cooperation.
Phony.
Thorny, like a thorn.
Thorny, okay, thorny, yes.
Is there any value to the annexation to the settlement blocks directly across the Green Line, Gush Etzion, Ma'ale Adumim, while differentiating blocks further into the territories, those in the Jordan Valley? Is the question clear?
Yeah, it's not a legal question. It's more of a political question, and I'm happy to try to answer that. But I'm not sure whether I'm the expert on the matter. I can give you my opinion as an Israeli, and as many Israelis look at areas. You know what? I'm going to pull up a map. Okay, is it okay to pull up another map? So you'll forgive me for. And again, there's no maps available of the. Hold on a second. I'm going to share this. This is where I was, and now we're going to. This is a map that there's no maps of the deal of the century. Okay, but there's all kinds of thoughts about how things should look. So this is one map that exists showing the problem of having a deal of a century for. This is the Gaza Strip. How do you connect the two areas? Okay, Gaza Strip, West Bank. Okay, and the deal of the century says that areas within Israel, some areas within the West Bank would be reverted to Israeli, annexation, whereas some areas within Israel, this area along the Egyptian border and this area along the Egyptian border would be reverted over to the Palestinians. Okay, that there would be sort of a swap in territory. Okay. But I want to be more direct to the question that I was asked, and I'll show you maps that were put together by the Washington Institute for Near East Studies, and this is an interesting map, and assuming that this is the larger annexation piece. Okay, under this premise, all of the Jordan Valley Rift. Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Running here, all that area would be annexed into Israel, as would areas near the Israeli border. Okay, near the Israeli border would all be annexed under this premise. One that is being discussed, 29% of the West Bank would be annexed as part of Israel. That would include 130 settlements and 466,000 Israelis, as well as 78 Palestinian communities and roughly 110,000 Palestinians. Okay, and some of the issues that might arise in that area, in this matter, would be the issues that I mentioned before, as to the rights that would be provided for the Palestinians living within these areas. You can see here the blue marks, the blue spots are Israeli settlements, whereas the yellow spots are spots that are those are Palestinian communities within the areas that would be annexed. Okay, so I'm now gonna move on to the next map that exists here, because this is a second scenario. Okay, the second scenario is that, remember I talked a little bit about the security wall, the security barrier. Or I didn't actually. I showed you a map with a security barrier. I was also the lead. We've talked about a little piece of some of the stuff that I dealt with, and I was also I had a team of lawyers who oversaw major sections of the building of major sections of the wall, and that's we can have a whole separate lecture just on that topic. But what we're seeing here is the areas that are within the Israeli side of the security fence. Okay, Israeli in the sense that it's on the western side. These areas here are all encircled by the security fence, and many folks believe that in a future, the way that the final borders between Israel and the Palestinian entity will be is that any of these areas here that are within the Israeli side of the fence would be part of Israel, whereas all the other areas beyond the fence would no longer. Communities here, including perhaps in the Jordan Valley Rift. Under this scenario, roughly 360,000 Israelis, and that includes, by the way, someone asked about Ma'ale Adumim. Ma'ale Adumim is in this area. It's one of the largest settlements just east of Jerusalem. And under this scenario, roughly 360,000 Israelis would become, would now be living directly in areas that are Israel, and another 20,000 Palestinians. Many fewer Palestinians. You can see very few Palestinian yellow areas that we were talking about before. There's another scenario here, which is a much narrower scenario. There's two. There's one, Ma'ale Adumim, if any of you know, is a large town. Probably, I think it's the largest settlement in the West Bank. It's, for many Israelis, it's considered sort of like a suburb of Jerusalem. It's on the way, but it's in the West Bank. Okay, many of the people who live in Ma'ale Adumim are people who don't live there for ideological reasons. People move there because they could get cheaper housing, and they didn't move there because they're like verbrannte revisionists, but because it was just comfortable for them. They could get a bigger house, or they could get a cheaper house, or whatever. And I have my friends have kids my kids have friends who live in Ma'ale Adumim. Okay, it's not like it's not an issue, and it's very large. And in that area, for instance, 41,000 Israelis live in this area. If you annex only that, you're not annexing any Palestinians, and that would be sort of something that I think many Israelis could live with. And last but not least, the last map I can show you here on that is the Gush Etzion. I don't know whether any of you know, Gush Etzion is the southern, just south of Jerusalem, the Etzion block. This is an area that historically, up till 1948, was before the War of Independence, that had several kibbutzes and moshavs in it. It was overrun by the Jordanian government. There was a massacre of Israelis in that area, and one of the plans says we should annex that territory. There are now Israeli settlements there. Under that plan, Gush Etzion, there would be 96,000 Israelis that would be within those annexed territories. And there are, as you can see here, the yellow spots, there are Palestinian towns within that area. I think that for many Israelis, and I'm again not going into the politics of it, for many Israelis, that is within the consensus. Okay? Many Israelis say, historically this was part of, before 48, we had towns and villages there, kibbutzim, moshavim, and we have a historical right to that area. It's just right near Jerusalem, and so it's a very long answer to the short question that whoever asked, but it's not an easy issue, and I'm not going here to discuss the reform movement's position on that. That's a whole other kettle of fish. I'm willing to open that up for discussion as well. I'm going to leave the stop share. I actually have a nice thank you here as well for the end of the discussion. But if anyone wants that, if there's any other questions, Rabbi Zachary, I'm happy to answer.
So there was one. We have a few more, but I'll end with maybe just two more questions. One question is about going back to Qumran. That was one of our very first questions. And it seems a concern that there's Qumran with this connection to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and how that ended up in Area C rather than in Israel proper.
What you mean from that it's like why is it in Area C? Because we didn't annex that territory. It hasn't been. It's right next to one of the settlements called Kalia. It's in the Judean desert. It was the Qumran was in basically all kind. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in caves above Qumran. Biblically, there was Jews who were involved in the Qumran biblical or historic settlement. Fascinating history. There was whether they were sort of a renegade group that ran off to the desert, who decided to have some sort of independence of themselves, of their cells. It's not in Area C. It's not. It's in Area C, and it was not annexed. So I don't have a legal answer to that. It's just a factual. The fact of the matter is that it remains parts of Area C, which is an area that Israel has as much control under its military government as possible. It runs the archaeological site there through its civil administration. So I don't know whether that's a good enough answer to the question.
I think it's great. Thank you. For our last question, and it might be perhaps another opinion-based question rather than a legal-based question, but we'll pose it nonetheless. Should a transfer of settlements from Israeli military administration to civil administration transpire at some point? And if so, what international reactions and sanctions do you anticipate, or the response of the Israeli government?
So I think that's one of the major issues. How the international community will react to Israel annexing territory. That's basically the annexation. So the American administration it's their deal. It's Trump's deal of the century, and I don't think it's so long as Trump is in power, and who knows whether that will happen or not, and. There probably won't be a big backlash. The European community is up in arms about that, and there's all kinds of demands to already mark produce coming out of the settlements, so that people know or can boycott those products when they come out of the West Bank. I think that there will be a large. If Biden wins the American election, it'll be interesting to see whether the new American administration continues that line. I have a feeling that it won't, but the time will tell. And I don't think that any Israeli government in the near future is going to move this forward, because it's just unless Netanyahu, we're being threatened with a fourth round of elections within a year and a half. Literally, as we speak, it looks like our government, in the midst of the worst pandemic of this century, certainly, and of the worst economic strife that we've had in this country in our 70-plus years of existence, our politicians can't stay together and keep a government together. And it looks like we're moving quickly towards a fourth round of elections, probably because and again, this is making an opinion, that we have a prime minister who's very concerned about his own skin, and would like to find a way to continue to be in control, so that he is not indicted or does not have to go through with some of the criminal proceedings that are up against him. I'm not sure whether some of his intentions are bona fide vis-a-vis moving forward, but I think I'm moving into an area that was not part of I'm happy to give you my opinion, but it's I'm not sure whether that is within the realm of the discussion here that we were meant to speak about.
Well, let me say that your both legal expertise and your opinion are very well appreciated, and we know come well vetted. So Yair, thank you so much for your time today. As people were leaving, they were sending many thanks in the chat. But let me say again on behalf of Arts of Canada and Holy Blossom that we really appreciate you making yourself available to us, even at this late hour in Jerusalem. We really, really do appreciate the opportunity to learn from you and to be together. I know it would have been much nicer if we could have flown you into Toronto and done this in person, but we really appreciate your expertise. And to everyone who's here with us, just a shameless plug. At Holy Blossom this year, we were hoping to make it to Israel on a congregational trip in October. That is obviously no longer possible, but we are doing a virtual Israel trip. So if that is something that you are interested in, please shoot me an email at zgoodman@holyblossom.org, and I'm happy to give you some more information. Information is forthcoming. We're just crossing our T's and dotting our I's, but we are very excited about this innovative virtual Israel trip.
Can I just say one other thing? It's important for me to understand, for all you folks to understand how important the connection between yourselves and the Israel in general, but the Israel Reform Movement is as well. And I think this is a good time, opportunity to make a statement about Arts of Canada and the support we received from Arts of Canada. Arts of Canada recently had this incredible evening that was all about supporting our movement in Israel, your movement in Israel. And I talked tonight about some of my war stories and some of my legal experience, but I'm happy to also join you at some other time to talk about how exciting the times are, despite all the difficulties within the Israeli reform movement, and how there's so many opportunities, and how we look forward to continuing the connection between ourselves and our good friends everywhere. And in particular in Canada, for me, I'll stop with the way I started, is saying how thrilled I am to be here. Any connection to Canada for me is always a thrilling connection. And Toda Rabba. It's lovely to be here with you. And I look forward to seeing many of you when you can come with your congregational, whether it's Holy Blossom or other synagogues, come to Israel, come to visit our synagogues here in Israel. We're a vibrant, very interesting, different reform movement here in Israel, but very much part of the world reform movement as well. It's wonderful to be amongst friends. Toda Rabba. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov. Thank you so much, Yair. We appreciate your time. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.